How's it going, everyone? This is Boots with Snapkeep Arcade, back with another deck guide. This week we have Mason Clark of the Constructed Criticism podcast to tell us about this amazing deck, Fibblethp and Friends. As of this recording, Mason is in the top 20 players in Magic Arena. Mason, why don't you tell us about Fibblethp and Friends?
So the idea behind this deck is, if I'm remembering the story correctly, Ben Reagan showed this to Zach Elsick, and Zach Elsick kind of tuned it into a prison deck. It really plays out where you slowly acquire planeswalkers and they kind of lock your opponent out of ever winning the game. Because your cards are so good at grinding and surprise planeswalkers are good at going long, your deck eventually just kind of takes over the game through incidental card advantage and you lock them out. And then you play 5 board sweepers in order to take care of all the creature decks. And really you kind of sit back and you figure out a way to win. Sometimes it's Mobilized District, sometimes it's Teferi. A lot of the time it's them conceding because they see the writings on the wall. But basically that's kind of the goal of the deck. This is the part that really infuriates me, because I get messages like, is Fibblethip supposed to be in the deck? Are you memeing with Fibblethip? What's up with Fibblethip? If Fibblethip was Elvish Visionary and this was a green deck, no one would ask me questions about Fibblethip. And that's just prejudice on Fibblethip. I don't appreciate that personally, but Fibblethip actually does a lot of important things for this deck, jokes aside. Fibblethip helps turns on the 2 Mox Ambers in the deck a little early, so sometimes you're able to get down your 4-mana planeswalkers like Kasmina or the one of Nahiri, which is still one thing about this deck too. Once we're recording this, is this deck's gone over a lot of changes in the last 78 hours or 72 hours, and it's going to keep changing. I think we're still trying to figure out the best version of the deck right now, but it lets you get to those spells quicker and also lets you cast your sweepers quicker, lets you double spell a bit more. So Fibblethip does a pretty important job with that. It also replaces itself, and actually with the way the format's broken, Fibblethip's not a bad chump block in the early games. Against mono red, it stops Maniacal Firebrand and Bashina Pyromancer. Against the white deck, it trades with almost all the 1-drops, which you don't really want to trade your 2-mana plays for a 1-mana play. But in this situation, we just need to buy time. So a card that replaces itself and does that is really, really helpful. Also, sometimes that will entice them to do things like Loxodon, which is pretty good because we're trying to get them to commit a bunch to board for Cleansing Nova. So if they take a turn doing Loxodon plays, we're not taking damage, and we can use like Mox Amber to cast it early. That's been a fairly prevalent line with the deck. The deck used to play 3 Mox Ambers, it's down to 2 right now, so that comes up a little bit less. But Fibblethip is just good value. You also sometimes will attack with like a Fibblethip to pressure a walker and then use Teferi Time Raveler, minus on your own Fibblethip, draw a card, replay Fibblethip, draw. Since your deck doesn't have a lot of mana sinks, it only has really using it with Karn's Bastion, and also has the Mobilized District, which doesn't really cost mana most of the time. So Fibblethip kind of does a lot of different things.
Awesome. Let's go over every single planeswalker in the deck.
All right, so let's start off with the order in which I'm seeing them on my deck list on Arena. And this is Narset, Parter of the Veils. Fun fact, Narset's one of my favorite planeswalkers, so I'm loving having her in the deck. Narset is kind of like your Augur of Bolas in this deck. I was talking to a friend, I was like, man, I wish I could actually just play Augur of Bolas. That'd be like a better Fibblethip. But Augur doesn't find planeswalkers. Narset finds every single card in your deck except lands and Fibblethip. So Narset almost always hits. And then Narset actually has the trinket text of each opponent can't draw more than 1 card each turn, which is relevant in some of the harder matchups. So like next to the Fate and the Esper control decks, they can draw a lot of cards and that can be a problem. And Narset stops those decks and helps slow them down while finding our pivotal pieces. Also allows you, the original version of the deck had a lot more 1 and 2 ofs. Narset was a good job of congealing that. Narset does a good job of just finding the cards we want to find. The next planeswalker is Dovin, Hand of Control. This is one that I think a lot of people didn't think was going to be pretty good, and I have to admit I was been impressed by how powerful it is. Dovin, Hand of Control, in case you don't know, has the passive ability of artifacts, instant, and sorceries cost 1 more, which is super helpful against the Control and Nexus deck. Once again, if you kind of curve out on that, whereas next ability that we're talking about isn't super relevant, he still kind of does something, and against the aggro decks, he makes it hard for the red deck to double spell in the early turns. And then coming in at 5 loyalty, you can -1, and until your next turn, you prevent all damage that would be dealt and done to target permanent your opponent controls. So basically bubbles a creature, that way that creature can't hurt you or your planeswalkers. This is pivotal in a lot of matchups. Since we're trying to protect our planeswalker, Dovin protects all of them from whatever the biggest creature on the battlefield is at that time, forcing our opponent to commit more to the board, which we have Teferi Time Raveler to slow them down. We have Nahiri to slow them down. We have all the board wipes. We have Big Teferi. and we have Ugin. So you have a lot of ways if you can just buy some time against them to extend the board. You can keep kind of picking away. They keep having to commit more, and eventually they have to play into your board wipes, which you're finding pretty easily thanks to all your cantripping and your Narsets. So Dovin does a great job, and it's also super good against some of the more fringe decks. Decks I think that are really good still, but like haven't quite come to fruition. Like I think Gruul is a deck that's actually kind of a hard matchup for this deck, but it's not seeing a lot of play right now. And I think one of the harder parts of that deck is Rekindling Phoenix. Dovin handles cards like that. I've had my Dovin locked down. Steel Leaf Champions, Galtas, Rekindling Phoenixes, even just Savannah Alliance, the multitude that the mono white deck plays in that one. So Dovin, I think, is great. You trim Dovin a lot post board, but the fact that he's kind of good, he's great in the aggro matchups and good enough in the kind of bad matchups means that he's kind of an all-star. Also, perfect for handling Thief of Sanity. Gotta love that when you're playing against the Esper mid to game 1. Next, we have Teferi Time Raveler. This is the card that a lot of people are saying is the best card in the set, and I've got to say, full admission, I was wrong. I thought this card was overhyped at first. It has blown me away. So Teferi Time Raveler says each opponent can cast spells only at the time that they could cast a sorcery, meaning that on our turn, we turn off all the counter magic, all the spot removal, all that kind of nonsense, and we get to just play our walkers and do our thing. You can tick up and you can cast sorceries as though they had flash. This is really important for our board wipes. If you're able to stick a Teferi Time Raveler and kind of buy one turn without the Teferi dying by ticking up, and then on the next turn you can normally with a Mox Amber or through other means buy enough time to get to a Wrath, and then your opponent will play into the Wrath on their turn trying to kill your Teferi and stuff like that. And those are backbreaking turns. But really the crazy part about this card is the -3. You can return up to one target artifact, creature, or enchantment to its owner's hand and draw a card. A lot of time what this card does is it becomes a mana war. You play it, you bounce it, and then draw a card. Bounce something they have. And in every matchup, there's something to hit. The control decks have Azcanta, which setting them back on Azcanta for a turn can be really big. In that kind of the mid game, all the creature decks, they all kind of want to curve out on you. And like if you're on the play and your opponent goes Steamkin, you can play this in minus. And while your Teferi's probably going to die, the Steam King going off is one of the better things that red can do on turn 2, and slowing them down off that is important. And even making them go like Steam King Shock as a way to answer your Teferi can normally buy enough time, because a lot of times you just need to buy time against the red and the white decks, because we do have some incidental game life and we have all those board wipes we're drawing to. Next up, we have Saheeli Sublime Artificer. Saheeli is a card that has gotten a lot of press and I think is great. The first part of the text box doesn't really matter in our deck at all, but the second part, the passive ability does, where whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 color silver artifact creature token. This is pretty good at actually just creating creatures, which our deck is not very good at doing, right? We only have incidental tokens and Fibblethip when it comes to creatures. So having a way to create creatures is good in the matchups where our opponent is having a hard time taxing us there. It also is a great card to curve out to if you were trying to protect something. If you go like Saheeli on turn 3, since it starts with 5 loyalty, she starts with 5 loyalty, they can attack her probably pretty low, and then you can play a card like Kasmina or Dovin, make a servo, make another token with your walker, or maybe lock down a creature, and then boom, now you're starting to clog the board up. They have to commit more to the board to place towards the board wipe. One thing to know about this deck is, as long as board wipes are good in standard, I think this is a good deck. So Saheeli does that, and then post board we actually have a Saheeli. You're able to bring those in against decks that have sideboard out a lot of their removal spells that are probably dead game 1, and now you have another angle of attack where they have to answer these planeswalkers and answer all your tokens, which can be a real problem. Kasmina, the Mentor, I don't know how to say that first word, is an interesting card that's actually taken the spot of Karn, which has been surprising to some people. I'll talk about that as soon as I'm done saying what Kasmina does. Kasmina says spells your opponents cast that target a creature or planeswalker control cost 2 more to cast. She comes in at 5 loyalty, and you can -2 to make a 2/2 blue wizard creature token, draw a card, and then discard a card when that token enters the battlefield. So Kasmina is taking the role of Karn, because Karn could make these tokens, and we had Treasure Map, and only if Treasure Map was flipped was the Karn tokens really like sizable. So having Kasmina still have the selection that Karn does, while not as powerful as drawing a card, looting can still be pretty good in this deck, because you can be prone to flood out sometimes. And having the 2/2 body is good, because while Karn protected itself by having a lot of loyalty a lot of the time, like you would tick up Karn, it goes to 6, and it's like, geez, how does your opponent ever kill this? That's great if Karn's like your only planeswalker. If you have a bunch of planeswalkers in play, that's not good protection. So Kasmina, while not as powerful as Karn, Scion of Urza, which is probably like a top 20 planeswalker of all time, Kasmina does a great job protecting her friends, and for that reason, she gets in the deck. And her trinket text is actually pretty reasonably effective against the mono red deck. Sometimes they're off the top trying to strike down your creatures, and if they're like not hitting their land drops, it can be hard for them to cast Skewer or Wizard's Lightning. And then if they're flooding out, then you're probably having a pretty good time, and they're having to spend their whole turn doing that anyway, so they're not able to light up the stage multi-spell or Experimental Frenzy multi-spell and answer your Planeswalker. So pretty important there. And then Nebraska's Contempt, 6 mana is so much mana. So that goes to that for Kasmina. Nahiri, Storm of the Stone. Nahiri, it has a first line of text that your creatures have first strike. It comes up like once every 50 games, I imagine, but for the most part, it doesn't. Really what matters is she comes in at 6 loyalty and says Nahiri deals X damage to target tapped creature. So basically, Nahiri is just a repeatable removal spell that we can use our proliferate cards with, and some of our blink effects and our unsummon effects to reset and still get attacked in, and has the bonus of being easy to cast in our deck and give us the bonus life gain from the Interplanetary Beacon. Next up, we have Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Probably never heard of this card, so I'm not going to talk about its text. Basically, Teferi is here to be a spot removal spell for hard to answer permanents in the deck, and also be a backup win condition while being a form of raw card advantage, which the deck actually kind of lacks raw card advantage. There's a lot of pseudo card advantage with your Planeswalkers just generating incidental value every single turn, but you kind of lack raw card advantage that you would expect a control or prison deck to maybe have. And Teferi does that while also being a backup win condition of the deck, since sometimes it can be kind of hard to win. Teferi ult normally finds a way. Ugin the Infallible is the Planeswalker that has impressed me the absolute most from War of the Spark. Ugin is 6 mana, and it says your color spells cost 2 less to cast, so your Mox Ambers are super duper free, and it has the ability of +1. You exile the top card of your deck and put it face down, and that is a 2/2 creature, and when it dies or leaves the battlefield, it returns to that card, goes to your hand. So it's like a slow draw card, and then it has a -3 of destroy target permanent that's 1 or more color. So basically, it doesn't kill Karn and other Ugins in the format, but kills everything else. This card is a great one-of in the deck. Allows you to answer hard to answer permanents like other Planeswalkers. While you can accrue a lot of tokens, by the way, to kill Planeswalkers, it can be hard at times if you're not getting your engines going. So Ugin does a great job of answering Nicol Bolas, Godpharaoh, other opposing Teferi decks, and also just generates card advantage and a board, which can be really good, especially out of something like a 6-mana Planeswalker like this, where we have 5 board clears in the main deck. So you kind of have a good job of clearing the board on turn 5, and then turn 6 you want to follow up, and if they followed up with a non-creature spell, Ugin answers that, and if they start putting creatures on the board, you can tick up and slowly draw cards, find more Planeswalkers, take over the game. And that's all the Planeswalkers in the main deck. Mox Amber is a weird card in this deck. I'm not gonna lie, I'm not even sure if it's supposed to be in the deck. I could totally see a universe where 2 weeks from now we're not playing Mox Amber, but for right now it allows us to sort of cheat the mana system and get a little bit ahead off Fibblethp. Or it allows you to double spell a little bit in the mid game quicker, because you have a lot of 3 mana plays. Your curve's pretty top heavy, and as such, Mox Amber allows us to get there. And I mentioned earlier, but casting the board wipes a turn earlier is huge. Your opponent expects you to, have something to do on turn 5, but when you can do it on turn 4, since Mox Amber's free, you can display it as a quick land essentially and get them, is very nice. And every now and again, it does occasionally help with the double pips that Cleansing Nova and Narset Parter Veils have, but for the most part, it's not really helping our mana. For the removal, that's air quote removal, when talking about Callous Dismissal as well, we play the 5 board wipes, which I've alluded to a lot. We play 4 Cleansing Nova, which is great because sometimes decks have Azcanta, Wilderness Reclamation, that like the Nexus deck for the most part, that card would normally be dead, and in that matchup it's backbreaking against them because they do need their Wilderness Reclamations to normally beat us before we can really lock them out. So Cleansing Nova is great in that matchup. And Time Wipe is just another 5 mana sweeper. The deck was originally playing a Settle the Wreckage in the first iteration. Well, I think Settle is good and you could totally still play it, and maybe you're even supposed to play 1 in the sideboard. Your deck's a tap-out control deck, so when you leave up mana and cards in hand, it's kind of a big tell. Also, cards like Gruul Spellbreaker are pretty good. There are still people playing Mono Blue out there. I know it doesn't seem that way, but every now and again you run into them, and Scion Storm Tamer is really annoying to have Settle the Wreckage you run into. So Time Wipe, just a 5th Cleansing Nova really, and sometimes you play your Fibblethip on the earlier turns. You Mox Amber into this Time Wipe, and you bounce your Fibblethip, and you get a little extra value. So it's not like it's the absolute worst. Now, Callous Dismissal is an interesting card that I get a lot of questions asked about. I think Zach really found something special here with Callous Dismissal. What Dismissal does is, in case you don't know, is return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. That wording there is very important. And then you amass 1. So you make a 1/1. We do have a land that proliferates, so sometimes I've had it be a 3/3 before, like cast 2 Dismissals, proliferate, and then attack something. But basically what this does is it allows you against the early red decks and white decks and the Gruul decks to disrupt their plays while you need something to do in the early turns because your deck starts at 3 mana for the most part. So Callous Dismissal allows you to interact with them and put stuff on board. So like against mono red, you can like bounce their Steamkin and have a blocker for their Fanatical Firebrand. Or against mono white specifically, like you can bounce one of their 1-drops, and then the 1/1 will trade with almost every creature in the deck until they play a Banalish Marshal. And then it also kind of throws off their curve because the white deck is really all about 1, double 1, and then a 3-drop, or a power play, as I like to call them, whether that be Loxodon, History of Benalia, or Banalish Marshal. This disrupts that game plan while also providing a chump blocker, and you can just take hits. Just because it's there doesn't mean you have to chump immediately. You can play this on 2, bounce something, maybe play a Fibblethp on 2 because you have like a Guildgate. You play your Guildgate on turn 4, you play your Kasmina, and now you've got 3 blockers, right? You can just take some hit and save that 1/1 for the time where it's best for you. Now, in the control matchups, it's great to stop them from having a Teferi ultimate. It's great to keep Wilderness Reclamation off the board and to buy a little bit of time. Even though the Wilderness Reclamation gets the mana back at the end of turn, the thing that I think a lot of times people forget is that they're trying to use all the mana. So they have access to 8, right? If they don't play another land drop. But by making you making them spend 4 mana, they normally can't Nexus you unless they flip an Escanta or something like that. And in that case, you much rather flip Escanta, since if that card flips, it's normally lights out. And then I alluded to it earlier. It says return target permanent to its owner's hand. So you can get a little tricky. We have a lot of Planeswalkers that only go down, they don't go up. We have Narset, Dovin, and Kasmina, and Nahiri as Planeswalkers that only go down, and we can bounce our own Planeswalker and then reuse them. In the late game, I've actually done things like play a Narset Part of Veils, minus, next turn, like we pass, they do something back to me, minus, bounce, replay, minus, as just a way to generate cards. You can also get a little tricky at times with Teferi, since Teferi gives your sorcery spells flash. Your opponent might really need to kill, let's say, your Ugin, right? And so they dedicate a bunch of creatures to attacking Ugin. You can Callous Dismissal, and it becomes kind of a fog. So Callous Dismissal is actually just like a really powerful tool in the deck that I think was inspired, honestly, and really helps make this deck a real deck. So this deck plays a couple of utility lands. And this is the part where I know that I've really diverged from Zach in them. This is the one thing I noticed. I have seen him tweet a little bit about playing with Karn's Bastion, so maybe he's trying it out. But they had like a Blast Zone and extra Field of Ruins. And I really felt like we had all this mana sitting around all the time. And the Mobilized District, which we'll talk about in just one second, didn't really do anything. So I added extra Karn's Bastions to the deck. And in this version, I just added 1. So Karn's Bastion is a land that taps for colorless, and it is 4 and tap to proliferate. This is really great with your Planeswalkers. A lot of the Planeswalkers that we talked about only get 2 or 3 uses out of them if you don't want, assuming you're willing to let them die. And Karn's Bastion allows you to get more. It also allows you to just ultimate quicker. I've played games where I played Teferi on 5. On turn 6, I tick up, I proliferate with Karn's Bastion, untap some lands, proliferate again, and then on the next turn, proliferate ultimate my Teferi, which is a turn, I believe, 7 ultimate on your Teferi, which is normally game over. And if your opponent can interact with that kind of stuff, that's backbreaking, and that's something this card allows you to do, and your deck has so many little proliferate things. Another weird thing about Karn's Bastion, by the way, is that you can make Sagas trigger early by proliferating their thing, and then when it happens, it goes up to 3, or make it skip or whatever to whichever step that they might want to be hitting on their turn. For example, you can make the History of Benalia pop on your turn, and then on their turn they don't get to attack with a bunch of knights. So there's a lot of really cool things this does in the deck. So the next really big and important land in the deck is Mobilized District. So Mobilized District is a creature land that taps for colorless, and for 4 mana it becomes a 3/3 citizen creature, which is a weird creature type, if we just can talk about that for a second, with vigilance. And then it's still a land and has this weird ability. It costs 1 less to activate for each legendary creature and Planeswalker you control. The only creature in our deck is Fibblethip, which is legendary, so that helps out Mobilized District. All the Planeswalkers are legendary, or all the Planeswalkers count for this. So a lot of the time, this card costs 0 to 1 mana to activate, and actually just beats your opponent down or pressures their Planeswalkers while also defending your Planeswalkers. You'd be surprised how many times on turn 5 you could play a Walker, use its ability, kind of have a Mobilized District there, and your opponent attacks with everything, and you're still able to activate Mobilized District. It's quite impressive, and I think it's actually pivotal to the deck. I think if we didn't have Mobilized District, this deck would be really bad. And I think one of my big mistakes I made when I hit Mythic with the deck was I cut one to play another Karn's Bastion. I think that was just wrong. The next colorless land is Field of Ruin. Pretty self-explanatory card here. Just as Kanta can be a problem, and we really don't like our Nexus matchup's pretty bad, so it's kind of worth the bullet slot there. And then we have 4 Interplanetary Beacons, which is an all-star in this deck. And really, I talk about Mobilized District. If we didn't have that, the deck probably wouldn't work. Interplanetary Beacon, I know if we didn't have this land exactly, this would not be a deck. It's a land that says whenever you cast a Planeswalker spell, you gain 1 life. It's not legendary, by the way, so you can have a bunch of those. So there have been plenty of time from gaining 2 or 3 life on turn 2 or 3. I'm sorry, on turn 3 or 4 with my Planeswalkers. And you can tap to add a colorless, and you can spend 1 and tap and add 2 mana of different colors, which is unique. Spend this mana only to cast Planeswalker spells. So this allows us to play all these other colorless lands, if you don't count Interplanar Beacon, the other 6 colorless lands in the deck, and still be able to cast our Planeswalkers easily. It also allows us to cast things like Teferi, Time Raveler on turn 3 consistently by filtering our mana. And the life gain is so important against red and white. I cannot tell you how important it is, because if they spend a bunch of time attacking your Planeswalkers, right, you're gaining incidental life, which is giving you more time to find a board wipe and then stick 1 Planeswalker win off that. If their plan is, I'm going to avoid these Planeswalkers, I don't think I can race them, gaining 2 or 3 life, it's 1 or 2 life, let's not even be absurd, just 1 or 2 can be huge. You know, you win a lot of games at 1 or 2 with this deck, and that is thanks to Interplanetary Beacon. It's also great against the burn decks, right? If they are throwing burn at your face, right, and you're curving out Planeswalkers, which are slowing them down and letting you slowly take over the game, you're like essentially negating half a burn spell if you gain 2 life, right? And then in the late game, it pulls you out from where they can top deck you and reasonably win. And then if they're trying to kill your Planeswalkers with burn spells in the late game because they're trying to like stabilize, well, then it's going to take so many spells, you just have infinity time. So Interplanetary Beacon is a real all-star in the deck. So the sideboard is a little interesting. Well, I'll start with the Planeswalkers there, but just note that things are still being kind of figured out and the format's in flux, so I think there's a lot you can do here, and I'll mention some of the cards at the end. But the Planeswalkers we have in our sideboard is Saheeli, which we talked about earlier. We bring that in for like the Grixis matchups and the Esper matchups, just things where they're going to sideboard out all that removal. This is a great way to attack them on a different angle. And then we have Teyo, the Shieldmage. Teyo, the Shieldmage, is 2 and a white for a legendary Planeswalker with 5 loyalty that says you have hexproof, and you can -2 to create an 0/3 wall. Teyo is your burn sideboard card. I think mono white's actually I think game 1 is heavily favored you, and post board it gets better for them, and we bring in a few things. So I think we're favored overall, but against red, game 1 can be a little hard. And I think Teyo does a great job of shoring up that matchup. Sometimes you actually just play Teyo and leave it as a 5 loyalty Planeswalker. You don't even minus if it's in the later game, since you don't want them to be able to trade 1 burn spell for you. You want to make them trade 2 burn spells. And then in the early game, you play it, it generates a wall. If they want to lightning strike the wall in order to attack your Teyo, you've gained a bunch of life that way. If they can't strike down the wall and they have to just play more creatures, then the wall in theory is buying more time, which is giving you time to draw your board clears, time to build up your army. And also you can always, minus they attack a bunch of your Teyo, let the Teyo die, and now those walls are there to protect the next Planeswalker. So Teyo is a really great hammer for the mono red matchup. We have Prison Realm, which is 2 and a white for an enchantment that when it enters the battlefield, you exile a target creature or Planeswalker an opponent controls until Prison Realm and it leaves the battlefield, and then it scries 1. Like I kind of talked about earlier, sometimes you have to use your Teferis to minus on things, and Planeswalkers can be sort of hard to take down, which is why Mobilized District is so good, or one of the reasons it's so good. So Prison Realm is a great job of answering those cards while also being a catch for creatures. So like an example of a matchup where they bring in creatures and sell these Planeswalkers we have to deal with is Esper Control. And in that deck, they have Thief of Sanity, which is a real problem card. This answers the Thief on 3, but also the Teferi on 5. So Prism Realm is an all-star of the deck. 3 might be a little too much, but I've been more happy to draw extra Prism Realms than not draw Prism Realm. We have 2 Sorcerer Spyglass. This is really to answer Search for Escanta. Like I've alluded to, Nexus of Fate I think is the one. I use this lightly here, real established deck in the metagame right now that is a hard matchup, and this is there to stop that while also stopping Nicol Bolas God Pharaoh. Nicol Bolas, I believe it's the Risen, is the flip half of Nicol Bolas, and it also stops Teferis on their side, and you're willing to let your Teferis be bad if their Teferis are shut off, because normally the opponent's Teferis are better Teferi decks than you are. You use Teferi as like a weird janky win condition or whatever, and they use it as a raw take over the game card. You have 2 Negate and 2 Disdainful Stroke. This is just to have answers to opposing negates and other non-creature problems that are non-creature threats that are a problem, like Wilderness Reclamation, etc. And Disdainful Stroke is a similar card, but also there to stop mid-range matchups like Grixis and Sultai, where they bring in a bunch of big threats to try and take you down. One thing I'll note, it's been a common question that's get asked, is why not Dovin's Veto? I think there's 2 really good reasons for that. The first is we play 10 colorless lands for the sake of Dovin's Veto with our 4 beacons and then all of our utility lands. So that can be a little yikes for me. The second is I don't know if the can't be counter clause matters a lot, because our deck has only 4 counter spells in the 75, which means you can only have 3 more that you could have drawn. And most likely Disdainful Stroke doesn't even matter in a counter spell war unless they're playing Devious Cover-Up. So you really only have 1 more counter spell. So you're not going to be fighting a lot of counter wars. And so if they're using a bunch of their counter spells to like win these counter fights, like let's say you go Narset and then they go counter, and then you go Negate and they go counter. It's like, okay, my entire deck loses to Negate. I only have Fibblethip that gets through Negate in the 75. With that being the case, I'm okay with being able to lose these counter wars. I'm not going to win them anyway, so I try and have those battles. And so I'd rather have a card I can consistently cast than a card that has bad mana cost or a restricted mana cost in the deck, even though it's better when you can cast it. Baffling End is there for all the aggressive matchups. Decks that can go under us can be a problem. You just need a little spot removal. And this is Zach Elsick found this card, which I think is actually quite good in the deck. It's Isolate. It exiles target permanent with converted mana cost 1. It's great against mono blue, great against mono white. I think mono blue is almost in the spot to be a real player again. So having this kind of card is very nice. Things that I have thought about adding to the sideboard that aren't in there right now, or things that have been played before, is I really like the 1 Lyra we had. I felt like our opponents weren't playing around us bringing in creatures post board, so that was nice. I think Nezahal kind of does a similar role, and I believe that Tithe Taker is a card that could see play in like a Baffling End type spot, where it has a little bit of game against the control decks because you're kind of zagging on them when they're trying to zig, and then it makes it harder for them to counterspell you, and also just being a resilient threat against the creature decks, where they're like, okay, I'll attack all my Savannah Lions into your Planeswalker. You're like, all right, well, Tithe Taker's going to block. My Planeswalker is going to go to 1 loyalty. Now I have a 1/1 Spirit to protect the Planeswalker on the next turn. So just 2 bodies in 1 card is something that I wanted to test out. But there are a lot of cards. You can play, in theory, almost any Planeswalker because of the Interplanetary Beacon, within reason, of course. We can't play Nicol Bolas easily, at least. So there's a lot that can be done with this deck, and this deck is really powerful. And it's really just a good time. You know, if you're not trying to like win a big event, at least play this deck because it's just fun. Playing with a bunch of Planeswalkers is just good, clean Magic, the way Richard Garfield intended it. I have been really impressed with the deck. I am playing it at my MCQ this weekend. Last night I peaked at 13, and as of this time of this recording, I'm ranked 18 on Mythic. So yeah, I think the deck's good. I haven't had much trouble with anything that isn't Nexus of Fate. I assume Esper midrange is a problem for you, but I think that deck has enough problems, enough bad matchups that we're willing to take that L. So if you want to hear me talk more indefinitely, you can check out the Constructed Criticism podcast, where I'm now the new co-host with Spencer Howland and Trey McLarnon. If you're watching this video, you might be seeing on the Constructed Criticism YouTube channel, so you already found out. If not, make sure to check out the YouTube channel, check out the Snapkeep Arcade videos as well. And you can see the podcast there in video form. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I've been posting a lot about this deck list and kind of updating people. I'm at Mason E. Clark. Feel free to slide into my DMs, and I'm willing to talk about this deck with you, especially if you have ideas for the deck. I'm definitely wanting to work on this deck a lot. So hit me up there. And then you can check out my Twitch channel at twitch.tv/TheMasonClark. I have a couple of VODs of me playing this deck, and I'm probably going to stream a little bit later tonight. So there'll be a new VOD up soon with the newest version of the deck.
Thank you so much to Mason Clark of Constructed Criticism for joining Snapkeep Arcade this week. And if you like this video, please hit that subscribe button and hit that notification bell to get notified whenever we upload a new video. This has been Boots with Snapkeep Arcade. Thanks for watching.